Now, close your eyes, or just soften your gaze, and come with me to a time when silence wasn't an escape, but a decision, when the path to peace demanded sacrifice. This is the story of what you had to give up to become a monk in ancient Japan. It didn't begin with a ceremony. It began with a choice, or, for many, the illusion of one. Before we go further, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and if you've been enjoying these quiet journeys into the past, consider subscribing. Only if it feels right. Maybe drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where in the world we share these moments of stillness. In ancient Japan, especially during the Heian and Kamakura periods, becoming a monk was not always a purely spiritual calling. For some, it was the only way to escape poverty. For others, it was forced, a political move by noble families, a punishment for disgraced samurai, or the fate of a second son who wouldn't inherit land. The road to the monastery was often paved with pressure, not peace. When you entered the temple gates, you left behind more than your name. Your old clothes were stripped. Your head was shaved. Your identity, who you had been, who your family wanted you to be, was burned away like incense smoke. You were no longer someone's son, brother, husband. You were a novice, a servant of the Dharma, a ghost of your former self. You gave up meat. You gave up alcohol. You gave up your hair, your possessions, and your voice, at least during the long stretches of mandatory silence. But the biggest thing you gave up was certainty. Life in a temple was strict, yes, but also unpredictable. Fires could sweep through wooden halls. Bandits could steal food offerings. Political tides could change, and with them, the fortunes of your monastery. You weren't seeking control. You were surrendering to a life of discipline and detachment. Even your name wasn't yours. Upon ordination, a monk received a Dharma name, often in Sanskrit or Kanbun, the Chinese-inflected Japanese of scholarship. This wasn't just tradition. It was transformation, a declaration that the person you had been would not follow you into the cloister. The past was gone. You had to let it go, or at least pretend to. But memory lingers. That's what they don't always tell you. That even with a shaved head and a new name, a monk might still remember the scent of home, the laughter of siblings, the warmth of someone's touch, the sting of a father's disapproval, the hunger for something more than rice and ritual. The novice learned to suppress, to bow, to kneel until his legs ached, to chant until his voice cracked, to sweep leaves without disturbing their pattern on the stone. The world behind the gate didn't vanish. It just faded. And that fading, that slow surrender of everything once held dear, was only the beginning. The path to becoming a monk in ancient Japan didn't begin with peace or enlightenment. It began with loss. And it began early, sometimes before a child could even understand what was being taken from him. For many boys, this life was chosen not by themselves but by the circumstances of their birth. In samurai families, especially among the upper and warrior classes, inheritance was rigid. The eldest son received the land, the legacy, the duty to carry on the family name. Second and third sons? They were often ushered toward the monastery, not out of passion, but out of necessity. There simply wasn't enough to go around. Some were sent away due to political shifts, family shame, or a need to secure spiritual favor. Others, especially orphans or those born into poverty, had no other option at all. The transition wasn't gentle. Before a boy could take his first step into the world of the monastery, his ties to the outside had to be severed. The world he knew, his household, his mother's touch, the scent of seasonal foods, the sound of festival music, was gradually, sometimes brutally, stripped away. His head was shaved to mark his shedding of worldly vanity. His name was replaced with one that meant nothing to him, given by men he barely knew. The clothes on his back were taken and exchanged for simple robes, thick and rough. These weren't just symbolic changes. They were reminders. You belong here now. Your life before this is over. The monastery walls closed around him. Within them were order and ritual, repetition and silence. It became his home, his school, his world. But it was not a place of warmth. Structure replaced affection. Discipline filled the void left by freedom. Mornings began before the sun, sometimes with a bell, sometimes with a nudge from an older monk. Meals were taken in silence, swallowed quickly. Studies included dense scripture, calligraphy, and ritual chants in languages he often didn't yet understand. He memorized motions before he understood meanings. Understanding would come later, if it came at all. Some boys spent years in obedience without ever truly believing, but belief was optional. Discipline wasn't. Family visits were infrequent. A familiar face at the temple gate was a rare event. Letters, if allowed, came perhaps once a season, if at all. The separation was by design. You couldn't truly detach from the world if the world kept reaching out to you. For many, the pain of loss didn't fade. It simply dulled. A mother's lullaby, the feel of his father's rough hands, the laughter of siblings. These became memories worn down like stones in a stream. He didn't speak of them. No one did. Emotions weren't forbidden, but they were constantly pruned. Too much laughter earned you silence. Crying brought a stern lecture on impermanence. Anger was punished with extra chores or solitary reflection. Monks weren't supposed to cling to joy, to pain, or to each other. But of course they did. Quietly. Secretly. By the time a boy grew into a young man, the world outside the temple had dimmed. He could chant perfectly in rhythm with others, but might struggle to remember the smell of his childhood home. He could recite entire passages from sacred texts, but forget the face of a brother he once played with. Whether he believed in the teachings or merely performed them, it no longer mattered. The rituals had sunk into his bones. That was the first cost of becoming a monk in ancient Japan. Your past. Not just left behind, but carefully dismantled. Not just forgotten, erased piece by piece, until it no longer had a voice. Most people imagine that becoming a monk in ancient Japan was a peaceful decision. A quiet, meditative path chosen by those who sought serenity, reflection, and spiritual escape from the chaos of the outside world. And while that picture isn't entirely wrong, it's more of a poetic ideal than a practical truth. The actual process of becoming a monk was much more intense. It wasn't simply about finding inner peace. It was about sacrifice. Deep, permanent, sometimes painful sacrifice. Not just of distractions or personal possessions, but of your very sense of self, your name, your identity, your past. The journey into monastic life didn't begin with the robe or the chants. It started long before your head was shaved. It began with a decision, and that decision often wasn't yours to make. In many cases, it was a family matter. Second or third sons who wouldn't inherit land or status were sent to temples to lessen the financial burden or strengthen the family's social connections. For some, it was a form of escape. Poverty, punishment, or scandal drove them behind monastery walls. And then there were those who truly chose it, pulled by devotion, spiritual longing, or the desire to dedicate themselves to a greater cause. But no matter how you arrived, the first demand was the same: renunciation. Renouncing your old life wasn't symbolic. It was complete. It wasn't just a ceremonial prayer or a spoken vow. It was an act of full erasure. You gave up your family name, disconnecting from your lineage. You forfeited any inheritance or legal standing. You had no right to own property or claim status. You let go of dreams, attachments, vendettas, and relationships. You became, in the eyes of both the temple and the world beyond, a blank slate, a vessel stripped clean, awaiting a new, disciplined form. Then came the physical transformation. The shaving of your head was not cosmetic. It was a visible declaration, a rite of passage, a renunciation of vanity and worldly concern. Every strand of hair that hit the ground was a piece of your former identity, falling away. When the last lock dropped, you were no longer a civilian. You were a novice monk, accepted in name, but not yet formed in spirit or discipline. Training began at once. It was not rushed, and it was not gentle. It was detailed, deliberate, and designed to rewire how you moved, thought, and even breathed. You learned the rituals, the precise timing of bells, the flow of chants, the structure of ceremonies. You were taught how to walk, slow, deliberate steps, how to sit upright, composed, immobile for long hours, how to bow with humility and intention. There was a correct way to touch objects, to serve food, to handle your robes. Every action had a purpose. Every silence carried weight. Your days began in the dark, hours before dawn, guided by the toll of temple bells and locked into a rigorous schedule that governed every moment. You had no control over how your time was spent. There was no indulgence, no space for personal preference. Even your speech was reshaped. You spoke less. When you did speak, your tone softened, your words chosen carefully. You avoided direct opinions. You lowered your eyes. You quieted your presence. The ego was not merely discouraged, it was actively dismantled. Rules were everywhere. Dozens, sometimes hundreds. Their quantity and strictness depended on the sect and the temple. There were rules for how to eat, when to eat, how to chew, how to swallow without noise. Rules for dressing, for how to fold your robes, for how to carry your bowl. Rules for when to sleep, how to sleep, where to place your hands while sleeping. In some temples, you were forbidden to make eye contact. In others, you might observe full silence for hours, days, or even longer. Laughter became rare, almost taboo. And privacy? It hardly existed. You weren't left alone with your thoughts as a luxury, but because in a world stripped of distractions, solitude was often your only remaining companion. The life of a monk wasn't simply different. It was fundamentally other. You weren't just joining a new community. You were shedding your identity, emptying yourself to become something else. Or perhaps nothing at all. A body without ego. A mind stripped of want. A life defined by routine, by silence, by devotion, and by the constant examination and rejection of personal impulse. It wasn't immediate peace. It wasn't serenity wrapped in candlelight. It was subtraction. It was stillness, earned through hardship. It was a quiet, relentless unmaking of the self, carried out one rule, one ritual, one breath at a time. Long before the first chants of devotion echoed off the wooden beams of the temple hall, before the scent of incense drifted through the cold morning air, before bare feet whispered across stone courtyards still slick with dew, there was only silence. And in that silence, a decision had already been made. A decision not taken lightly. A decision most outside the temple walls could not understand. To become a monk in ancient Japan wasn't simply a spiritual calling. It was a dismantling of self, a complete and deliberate act of erasure. Not a single gesture was symbolic without weight. You didn't just walk up to a temple gate, bow your head, and find enlightenment. You gave everything up, completely and without condition. Your name, your family, your desires, your attachments. One by one, each part of your identity was taken, until what remained was only the framework of a human being, stripped to its essential purpose, It began with the head, the hair, the tonsure. It wasn't just a trim, it was a declaration. Monks shaved their heads entirely, sometimes using dull knives, scraping with bone tools, or burning it away with ash and oil. It hurt, it bled, it scarred. But that was the point. Vanity had no place in the path of awakening. Hair was seen as a mark of identity, beauty, and self-image. The monk's path required you to renounce all that, to reject the face the world had come to know you by. Next came the clothes. Whatever garments you once wore, fine silks, warm wools, family-crafted robes, were taken from you. In their place, you received a robe dyed in brown, gray, or muted saffron. The fabric was coarse, heavy, and intentionally uncomfortable. Every brush of it against your skin reminded you that the path wasn't meant to be easy. Sandals, if given, were thin. Splinters pierced them. Stones bruised the soles of your feet. Some monks chose to walk barefoot year-round. Pain was not feared. It was accepted, embraced, understood as part of the process. Your name, the name your mother whispered when you were born, the name written in clan records and spoken over generations, was taken. You were given a new one, usually in Sanskrit or Japanese, chosen by your master. It was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for meaning, for transformation. It marked your death as a member of the world, and your rebirth as a servant of the Dharma. From then on, the old name was never spoken aloud again. Family? That too was severed. Sons abandoned mothers. Fathers left behind crying children. Brothers became strangers. Some were orphans, handed over to the temple in desperation by parents who could no longer feed them. Others came willingly, fleeing dishonor, punishment, heartbreak. Regardless of the path that led you there, once you entered the temple, you were cut off from the world. You might never see your family again. And if you did, the ties that once bound you would be threadbare. You were no longer a son or a husband. You were no one. Possessions? Nothing remained. Jewelry was stripped. Books were donated or burned. Family heirlooms were returned or discarded. You were allowed only what the temple provided: a bowl for food, a robe to wear, perhaps a string of wooden prayer beads. And even those were not truly yours. They belonged to the Sangha, the monastic community, to the Dharma, to the life you had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen you. Even your body was no longer yours. Over time, it was regarded less as a personal vessel and more as a tool, an instrument for service, for meditation, for the pursuit of something beyond the self. Discipline overruled comfort. Simplicity crushed indulgence. The body was a thing to be trained, tempered, and ultimately transcended. So began the transformation, not in a dramatic moment, not with fireworks or spiritual clarity, but with quiet subtraction, with small, steady losses. One thread at a time, the life you had once known was pulled apart, unraveled, dissolved. And what replaced it wasn't serenity. Not yet. It wasn't peace or purpose or enlightenment. It was silence. A silence that stared back at you. A silence that waited. A silence that demanded everything you were and everything you hoped to become. The life of a monk in ancient Japan didn't begin with peace or wisdom. It began with loss. But not the kind people romanticize in poems or meditative retreats. No. This was the raw, piercing kind of loss. It cut deep and wide. Before there was clarity, there was removal. Before you could take a step toward enlightenment, you had to be stripped of everything you thought made you a person. The very first step? Letting go. But not just of things, of identity, your name, your lineage, your belongings, your hopes for the future, all of it had to be left behind. You didn't just exit society. You had to vanish from it. Becoming a monk wasn't an addition to your life. It was a subtraction of self. You weren't adding peace or virtue. You were erasing everything that stood in the way of them. Most monks didn't choose this life as adults. They were boys, children. Some were given to the temple by struggling families, another mouth they couldn't feed. Some arrived broken by war, orphaned, or disillusioned with the violent world. A few came willingly, drawn by the faint promise of something more than survival. But regardless of origin, the path was the same. Step into the temple, leave the world behind. The process was deliberate. You removed your clothes, shaved your head, and bowed deeply before the altar. These weren't gestures. They were symbolic deaths. The robe you received wasn't comfort. It was uniformity, a declaration. I will not stand out. Not with my words. Not with my thoughts, not with my wants. You were now part of a machine, an organism of rituals and stillness. The day started in the dark, long before sunrise. A sharp clack of wooden blocks would echo down the halls, your cue to rise. There were no voices, no names called, just the sound and your body's trained response. That was the rhythm now. You didn't live by your own time. You lived by the temple's pulse. Breakfast was silent. So was lunch. So was everything. A bowl of plain rice, a few pickled vegetables. On a good day, miso soup. No talking, no eye contact. Just quiet chewing, and the soft clink of bowls being set down in unison. You bowed before and after, not out of gratitude, but to reaffirm discipline. Food wasn't enjoyed. It was endured. Your body needed fuel to complete its duties. That was all. As a new initiate, you weren't trusted with wisdom. You were handed a broom, a cloth, a rag. You swept every inch of stone floor, scrubbed corners others wouldn't see, polished brass until your fingers cramped, and you did it again the next day, and the day after that. The lesson wasn't in the cleanliness. It was in the surrender. One speck of dust at a time. Your ego wore down. The silence didn't come from meditation. It came from aching limbs and repetition. The emptier you became, the more room there was for the teachings to fill you. Scriptures? Not yet. Philosophy? Later. First you had to sit still. Then you had to breathe. Then you had to prove you wouldn't fidget, wouldn't doze off, wouldn't drift. Only when you could hold your body like a stone and your mind like a still pond were you allowed to approach the texts. Wisdom was earned with discipline, not curiosity. Time moved differently in the temple, not faster or slower, just deeper. Every day was a copy of the one before and a rehearsal for the one ahead. You rose, cleaned, ate, meditated, chanted, cleaned again, ate again, meditated again. The pattern didn't change. What changed was you, slowly, invisibly, not in flashes or revelations, but like watching fog lift from a distant valley. You don't notice the shift until everything looks different. And in that slow, endless repetition, something softened. You stopped resisting the silence. You folded into it. And somewhere inside that hush, you began to understand the trade you'd made. What you'd given up wasn't just pain or noise. It was your old self. And what you gained, maybe, was space. Space to rebuild. Space to listen. Space to finally hear the sound of nothing and learn that it, too, had something to teach. The temple stirred long before dawn had a chance to arrive. Not in some poetic or metaphorical sense. No. The entire monastery, every wooden beam and sliding paper door, creaked into motion well before the sky gave even a hint of light. Dreams ended not with the gentle stir of waking, but with a jolt, a single bell toll, low and thunderous, rolling across the compound like a distant earthquake. It didn't just wake you, it reminded you that your body was not your own, that discipline was not optional, that your day had begun and you had no say in the matter. You sat up slowly, knees aching, back stiff. The floor beneath you was unforgiving, cold and dry like stone, even though it was polished wood. There were no blankets, just a thin straw mat and, if your seniority allowed, a folded cloth to drape over your shoulders. You moved in silence. Talking was forbidden. You folded your mat with care, corners aligned. You knelt to dress, robes of coarse cloth, layered by habit rather than warmth, and marked with the wear of countless mornings just like this. Every gesture had to be deliberate, no wasted movement. Somewhere nearby, a senior monk was already listening. The first act of devotion wasn't prayer. It was cleaning. Before the sky brightened, before the sun thought to rise, your body was already in motion. You were scrubbing the wooden planks of the corridors, sweeping gravel paths with twig brooms, rinsing stone wash basins with hands that stung from the icy water. You didn't speak. No one did. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred, ritualized. Cleaning was never just about sanitation. It was about crushing the ego, about dissolving pride into the simple labor of obedience. You bowed to the broom. You bowed to the steps. You bowed to the moment. If you were hoping for a reward, an internal glow of virtue, a nod from a superior, you misunderstood. This was not about affirmation. This was about humility. Even the abbot, the most senior among you, had once scrubbed these tiles until his knees went raw. And on the right day, he might still do it, without a word, beside the newest initiate. Rank didn't excuse you. It demanded more of you. When sunlight finally touched the courtyard, you were granted entry into the main hall. It wasn't beautiful by conventional standards. No gold, no marble, no towering statues. Just wood, worn smooth by decades of knees and feet. Paper walls, stained and patched, incense holders tarnished but clean, faded cushions arranged in rigid lines. You sat, legs folded beneath you, hands resting palm up, eyes open but soft. The air inside was thick with quiet. Meditation began. There were no soft gongs to guide you, no soothing voice to talk you through the process. Just breathe. Just the slow burn of stillness. Thoughts came, memories of family, flickers of childhood, aches and worries and hungers. You were told to let them pass. Sometimes you did. Other times they clung like fog, and all the while, your back stiffened, your knees tingled, your ankles went numb. But you didn't move, because in this place, stillness was survival. Then came the chants, deep, rhythmic, carried by drums and the gravel of dozens of voices. You didn't lead, you harmonized. Your chant didn't soar above the others. It dissolved into them. You weren't a person anymore. You were part of the mechanism, breathing, intoning, enduring. By now, outside the walls, the village was waking, doors sliding open, fires being lit, someone feeding chickens, but none of that touched you here. Inside these walls, you had already endured an entire morning before the world had poured its first cup of tea. Far from the loud courts of emperors and the crowded streets of Kyoto, the mountain monasteries of ancient Japan promised peace. That was the promise, at least. The truth was something else entirely. Becoming a monk didn't mean retreating from life. It meant giving up your life, piece by piece, till almost nothing familiar remained. By the time you reached partway through your training, you'd already surrendered the world. Gone were your family ties, your old name, your place in society. All those layers had been stripped off like old armor, replaced with robes and ritual. And if you thought the world outside was chaotic, the inner world demanded even more discipline. Monks were expected to memorize long texts, often written in Chinese characters that could take years to master. These weren't light reading, they were dense with philosophy, layered in metaphor, and required not just memory but interpretation. You would chant them for hours, your voice echoing through the temple halls, merging with the voices of others in a steady rhythm that bordered on trance. And if you got it wrong, there was no gentle correction, only silence, only the disapproving glance of your master. Physical labor was constant. The image of a meditating monk under a cherry tree is poetic, but the day-to-day looked different. You chopped wood in the morning cold. You hauled water from wells dug deep into rocky ground. You tended crops, swept long corridors, and cleaned latrines that reeked in summer. The idea wasn't just to keep the temple running. It was to strip away the ego through humility, to find meaning in work that no one would thank you for. Even sleep was regulated. You were allowed only a few hours each night, usually on a straw mat in a shared hall. No pillows, no privacy. And you slept in your robes, ready to rise the moment the bell sounded. The day began before the sun appeared, and it ended long after your legs had grown numb from sitting. Food was sparse. A bowl of rice, a few pickled vegetables, maybe some miso soup, if the temple was doing well. Meat was forbidden. So were luxuries. Eating wasn't for pleasure. It was part of discipline. You ate slowly, mindfully, and in silence. Every grain of rice had meaning. And still, the hardest part wasn't the work or the hunger. It was the isolation. You could be surrounded by other monks and still feel entirely alone. Words were rationed. Emotions were to be watched, then released. Affection, desire, anger. These weren't just discouraged. They were seen as chains. To break free, you had to become almost transparent to yourself. This was the cost. You didn't simply join a monastery. You dissolved into it. Day by day, rule by rule, task by task, until the person who arrived there began to fade, replaced by something quieter, harder, and perhaps wiser. Before the first rays of sunlight warmed the temple stones, the monks were already awake, not just roused from sleep, but upright, kneeling, straight-backed, silent as stone statues. The stillness inside the dim room was total, broken only by the soft rustle of linen robes and the distant crackle of a brazier fed with pine wood. This wasn't the serene peace imagined in paintings or stories. It was discipline, routine, a surrender of the self to the rhythm of tradition. The start of a day where personal wants were not just discouraged, they were erased entirely. The monk's body didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the order. It belonged to the rules. It belonged to a life that required surrender at every level. First came zazen, seated meditation. But don't imagine a cozy, cross-legged position and tranquil inner calm. Number. This was a rigid pose. Legs folded precisely. Spine straight like a blade. Eyes lowered just enough to avoid distraction, but not so far as to seem sleepy. Breathing had to be quiet, deliberate, balanced. You weren't meant to follow your thoughts or indulge them. You were meant to let them drift by like leaves on water. Hunger, exhaustion, an itch you couldn't scratch, a memory of laughter from another life. You had to let them go. But the body fought back. A stiff knee turned to fire. A foot went dead. A cough clawed its way up from your chest. You held it down. Stillness was everything. Stillness was the practice. Then came the bell. A single deep chime that cut through the silence like a blade. The start of movement. But not a release, just the next step in the ritual. Breakfast, if one dared to call it that, followed shortly after. A bowl of watery rice gruel, maybe with a paper-thin sliver of pickled root vegetable. Maybe not. The meal was taken in silence. Not the polite silence of strangers at a shared table, but absolute monastic silence. No words, no looks, no motion beyond what was required. Each monk had a personal set of bowls laid out and used in precise order. After the last bite, the bowls were cleaned, not with soap, but with a splash of hot water and a slice of raw daikon rubbed around like a sponge, then eaten. Even the rinse water was drunk. Not a single grain was wasted. Not because food was scarce, but because waste signaled ego. The meal was not about pleasure. It was about humility, mindfulness, control. After that came labor. Not punishment, not chores, practice. Work was meditation in motion. You swept, chopped wood, hauled water, dug trenches, trimmed hedges, patched walls, each task to be done without rushing, without pride, without rebellion. Precision was valued, but so was patience. You didn't try to do more. You didn't try to impress. You just did. And it didn't matter who you were before, farmer, warrior, noble, merchant. The monastery scrubbed that clean. You emptied chamber pots alongside everyone else. You learned to bow with the same depth as the youngest novice. By midday, when the sun had climbed high and the stone paths glowed with heat, there might be more seated meditation, or maybe chanting, or scripture study. Sutras were not read in quiet reflection. They were memorized aloud, chanted in rhythm, syllable after syllable in a droning cadence that washed over the ears like waves. It was not musical. It was not emotional. It was repetition designed to wear down the self like water carving through rock. Errors were corrected swiftly, never cruelly, but without softness. There was no praise, only clarity. The words were not your own. They were the orders. Every single moment of a monk's life was scheduled. Every breath practically spoken for. And yet, somehow, time didn't pass the way it did outside the temple. It wasn't fast. It wasn't slow. It folded. It repeated. It hummed with quiet inevitability. Breath, bell, footsteps, silence. And within that rhythm, something began to change. The parts of you that clung, the ego, the need, the resistance, began to dull. They weren't gone, but they softened. And in their place came something else. Not peace, exactly, but steadiness, stillness, a quiet strength. The monk was not destroyed. He was reshaped, not erased, but taught to kneel. The temple grounds never truly slept, even deep into the night. When the sky hung black and star-pierced over the tiled rooftops, there was movement, subtle, constant, patient. The wind crept in between the wooden beams, slipping through cracks in the old timber, whispering along narrow corridors like a breath half-held. Paper screens shivered softly. Crickets sang from the grass. Leaves stirred in the trees beyond the temple wall. Dim lanterns cast flickering halos on the worn planks, glowing like drowsy eyes that never quite closed. And somewhere in the rear wing of the compound, hunched low in a small room with bare walls and cold floorboards, a monk remained kneeling, his head bowed low, lips shaping silent syllables from memory, chanting the same sacred lines he had repeated for years. This wasn't rare. Sleep in the monastery was never generous. It was carefully measured, like grains of rice in a famine, doled out in hours too few, and often broken by cold drafts, aching joints, or the sharp ring of a wooden clapper signaling the start of yet another early duty. The bedding was minimal, a straw mat, a coarse blanket. The kind of rest offered here wasn't comfort. It was necessity, and only just. Monks were trained to ignore their aches, to disregard the desires of the body. But even so, weariness came, and for some, it never fully left. Many chose to forego sleep entirely, devoting the night hours to spiritual discipline, quiet labor, or simply the still company of their own thoughts. In one room, a monk might be copying sutras, his brush dancing through delicate kanji with aching precision, oil lamps sputtering beside him. In another, a pair of hands quietly stitched a torn robe or prepared vegetables for the next morning's soup, the knife tapping softly against the board. At night, the temple transformed. By day, it was rigid, timed, structured, defined by bells and ceremonies. But after sundown, the edges of everything softened. The silence deepened. Time moved slower, like it too was meditating. The stillness exposed everything. Some monks found peace in this. They folded into the quiet, welcomed it. For others, it was harder. Loneliness stretched longer. Memories of another life, of family, of mistakes, of roads not taken, rose to the surface like breath from deep water. And in that vulnerable quiet, doubts had room to grow. An elder monk, now bent with age and mostly silent, once said the true challenge of the monastic path wasn't the fasts, the long hours of kneeling, or even the vows of silence. It was enduring the darkness, the kind that came when the candles burned low and no one else was awake, when your only witness was your own heart, and your only company was whatever thoughts refused to sleep. To fight that quiet unraveling, monks developed their own private practices. Some lit sticks of incense and watched the smoke rise like prayers without words. Others traced sacred patterns in the sand outside or fingered small stones in the dark, letting the motion anchor them to the present. A few paced the wooden halls barefoot, counting the creaks beneath their steps, timing their breath to the slow rhythm of their walk. None of these acts were officially prescribed. They were invisible to visitors and unspoken between monks. But they mattered. They kept the mind from slipping. Meanwhile, outside the temple walls, the world turned on. Farmers slept beside their tools. Nobles whispered over wine. Bandits stirred in the forests. Life continued, chaotic and restless. But within these walls, the monks kept their own vigil. They guarded not just the sacred grounds, but the fragile state of their own stillness. For all the rituals and rules, the greatest discipline was the one no one else could see, the discipline of facing the quiet and remaining whole. And so, in the deepest hours before dawn, while the rest of the world turned away into dreams or schemes, the monks of the temple knelt, walked, worked, or simply breathed, each of them locked in their own quiet struggle. Because no matter how calm or orderly a life might appear, the true test always came in silence, and the night, more than any scripture or sermon, laid bare who was still wrestling with what lay within. By the time you'd been a monk for a few years, the temple walls stopped feeling like a sanctuary and started to feel like something else entirely. Boundaries. Not physical ones you could climb over or break through, but internal ones that settled quietly into your bones. They weren't oppressive at first, just present. A stillness that stretched, pressed in, and slowly erased the edges of who you once were. Silent ones, heavy ones. The outside world didn't just fade away. It pulsed just beyond reach, like a heartbeat you could no longer sync with. You could feel it in the distant clatter of a market cart hitting a pothole, the wind carrying the scent of grilled fish on festival days, or the sudden spark of a child's laughter rising and falling over a hill you hadn't seen in years. Monks weren't supposed to crave the world, but monks were still human. The day-to-day rhythm of monastic life rarely changed. Wake before the sun's light crept across the floor. Chant until your voice settled into the silence. Wash with water so cold it bit at your fingers. Sweep the temple halls, the garden path, the sleeping quarters. Study dense scriptures written in fading ink. Work with your hands until they ached, mending sandals, hauling firewood, grinding inkstones smooth. Chant again until your knees ached from kneeling. Eat a meal in silence. Clean your bowl. Repeat the cycle again the next day, and the day after that. And yet, over time, the repetition started to feel like both a comfort and a weight, like being wrapped in a blanket that was just a little too tight. Some days, your thoughts wandered during the scriptures. Your voice droned out the sutras on autopilot while your mind crept sideways, back to a road that led to your childhood home, to the sound of your mother preparing rice, to the rhythm of a sibling's laughter. The memories didn't ask permission to return. They just arrived. And you let them stay, even as your lips continued to form ancient words. The things you didn't say before you walked away clung to you in the spaces between breaths. Inside the temple, everyone moved with quiet purpose. Even the smallest acts, folding robes with exact corners, lighting incense with deliberate care, aligning calligraphy brushes, were supposed to be done with total presence. To act without distraction was its own form of devotion, but even mindfulness could slip. And when it did, the cracks showed. A missed note in a chant, a candle snuffed too early, a moment of hesitation while bowing, a gaze that lingered just a second too long through a paper window toward the hills. The older monks noticed. They always did. They didn't scold, not directly. They didn't raise their voices or call you out by name. They just watched. They assigned more chores, harder ones, sent you to fetch water from the farthest spring, even in the dead of winter, asked you to meditate longer than everyone else, alone, facing the wall. It wasn't punishment. Not exactly. It was correction, realignment, a reminder. Discipline was everything. But there were no walls high enough to keep out memories, and no rules strict enough to stop dreams. Monks were expected to give up desire, to burn it away like incense smoke. But that didn't mean desire disappeared. It just hid, patient and quiet, waiting in the cracks, between bells, beneath mantras, inside dreams that still came when sleep was deep enough. Some nights, it took the shape of someone's face. Other nights, it was a taste, a touch, a place you thought you'd forgotten, and so you learned to sit with it, not to fight it, not to pretend it wasn't there, but to breathe through it, to let it rise and fall like the tide, like your breath, to not run, to not chase, to not speak of it out loud, but to understand. The struggle wasn't failure. It was the practice, the quiet, aching heart of it, the reason you had come here in the first place, to wrestle with your own humanity, to learn that peace wasn't something you reached. It was something you built. Every single day. It's midday in the mountains of ancient Japan. The sun glints off sloped rooftops and polished stone paths, and a bell echoes across the quiet valleys. Not as a call to action, but as a gentle reminder of time's slow, steady passing. Within the monastery walls, life unfolds with precise rhythm, and today, that rhythm guides the monks toward the meditation hall. This isn't the kind of peaceful sitting people imagine when they think of monks. It's not a soft pillow by candlelight or a dreamy moment of inner stillness. It is rigorous, structured, demanding. Monks enter barefoot, robes whispering against the cool floor, heads slightly bowed in practiced humility. There are no words, no eye contact, just stillness, cultivated like a garden. Each monk moves to their assigned place, sits with folded legs, a straight spine, and eyes half-lidded in that particular way that sees without looking. At first, the position feels manageable, even calming, but as time draws out, it becomes punishing. Zazen, or seated meditation, is not about peace. It's about discipline, awareness, and endurance. You sit unmoving for long stretches, an hour, sometimes longer. The goal is not comfort. The goal is clarity, born through strain. Thoughts are not invited. Sleep is forbidden. If your posture slackens or your focus fades, you'll feel the sudden strike of the kisaku, a flat wooden stick wielded by a senior monk to wake the body and sharpen the mind. It's not punishment, though it stings. It is correction. It leaves no resentment, only a sharper awareness of the moment. Outside, the wind stirs the pines and rustles the dry leaves, but inside, the only sounds are the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead or the softest sigh of breath being drawn in and out. The silence is not emptiness. It is confrontation, In the stillness, everything buried rises. Doubts, regrets, fear, desire. The monks are taught not to flee from it, but to face it, to meet what emerges with a steady breath and open eyes. Time slows in this space. Minutes stretch like hours. Legs go numb, backs throb. But the room holds its own sacred tension, a stillness that demands and gives all at once. And when the bell rings again, signaling the end of the session, the relief is not expressed with words or sighs. It's in the subtle exhale, the tiny shift of weight, the quiet return of motion to muscles long held. But the day is far from over. This was just one posture, one breath in the long, deliberate rhythm of monastic life. There is work to do, lessons to attend, meals to prepare, and prayers to recite. The silence continues, but it changes shape, because in the monastery, even the quiet moves with purpose. The wind whispered across the monastery rooftops, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, pine, and the faint trace of smoke from distant hearths. Inside, the flickering glow of oil lamps danced across polished wooden floors, casting long shadows on the worn tatami mats of the main hall. Monks sat in rows of stillness, their eyes half lowered, backs held in rigid posture, their breathing deep, steady, deliberate. For the seasoned monks, this discipline was second nature, an internal rhythm woven into their very marrow. Silence wasn't empty to them. It had cadence, meaning, a structure, all its own. But for the novice monks, the newly shorn, the recently arrived, the ones still adjusting to life without names or possessions, it wasn't serenity they found in the silence. It was torment. Holding still for hours wasn't tranquil, it was a trial by fire. Legs screamed from kneeling, feet throbbed and went numb, shoulders stiffened, backs burned from the effort of staying bolt upright, unyielding, and the mind. That unruly thing refused to follow the breath. Instead, it spun in circles, memories of their former lives, regrets they hadn't yet surrendered, gnawing hunger, fleeting irritation, doubts they didn't dare speak aloud. And through all that, they were expected to remain motionless. No shifting, no sighing, no scratch of an itch, no adjustment of robes. To move was to admit weakness, a lapse in discipline, a blemish on your daily record, which meant more menial labor, a smaller portion of food, perhaps a removal from a scheduled break. In the monastery, discipline wasn't just virtue, it was survival. Respect and reward hinged on obedience. Zazen, or seated meditation, was the core of monastic life. But the simplicity of the form, sit, breathe, be still, hid its true difficulty. The goal was to let go of self, to shed desire, distraction, and the never-ending voice of ego. Yet no one truly warned how hard that shedding would be. The rules were exacting. You did not close your eyes fully. Instead, you gazed softly downward, eyelids half drawn. Your breath must come from the hara, deep in the belly, not the shallow rise of the chest. Thoughts? You didn't fight them. But you didn't follow them either. You acknowledged, then released, again and again. Letting go wasn't natural. It wasn't easy. It felt like stripping paint from stone. Slow, uneven, painful. These novices had given up everything, family names, speaking rights, even their sense of identity, and replaced it with silence, stillness, repetition, and the constant presence of watchful elders who rarely offered comfort or clarity. The older monks rarely spoke, but when they did, it was with the gravity of thunder. Their words were often abstract, parabolic, elusive. A statement would arrive as a question as a riddle. What is your original face before you were born? A cryptic koan meant not to be solved, but to be lived with, wrestled with, lost in. It was teaching through confusion, wisdom through disorientation. Pain was a teacher too, Discomfort was not an enemy. It was the curriculum. Silence wasn't punishment. It was the path. And when a head drooped or a back slouched, the keisaku would descend, not with anger but with purpose. A sharp strike to the shoulders, a jolt of the present, a reminder, you are here. Now this moment is all there is. Wake up. But awakening didn't come like thunder. It was no flash of divine clarity, no sudden vision. It came like wind over stone, erosion, slow, relentless, day after day, thought after thought, until the noise in the mind quieted, until the silence was no longer an absence, but a presence, a fullness, a vastness, a strange, abiding calm. And in that calm, something shifted, not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. The self, so carefully clung to, began to dissolve, and in its place, a different kind of stillness grew, one that didn't punish, but carried. Not emptiness, but something unspoken and whole. Far from the silent serenity we often imagine, monastic life in ancient Japan could feel more like a slow surrender. Part 13 explores what happened, not when a monk first shaved his head or donned his robes, but when the years started to pass, when silence became the norm, when routine hardened into permanence. This was the middle of the path, neither the beginning of devotion nor its end, but the long, often overlooked stretch in between. By this point, most monks had lost the sharp ache of separation from their old lives. Family, identity, desires. They had all become ghosts, still lingering in thought, but no longer haunting the everyday. In their place came the discipline of the temple, the bells, the chants, the endless tasks. Each day followed the same tight rhythm. You woke early, long before the sun, to the low, steady tone of the temple bell. Your feet hit the cold floor, your hands folded into prayer, your mind already turning toward a day of repetition. Meals were taken in silence, rice, boiled greens, maybe a pickled plum. Nothing indulgent, nothing spicy, nothing loud. Food wasn't for enjoyment, it was for function. You ate just enough to sustain you, nothing more. Any hint of gluttony or fuss was seen as weakness. Every bite was meant to remind you of restraint. You worked, not in the sense of labor for gain, but in tasks that shaped both the temple and yourself. Sweeping gravel paths, scrubbing stone steps, copying sutras with aching fingers and a bowed back. Every motion done with intention, and every intention supposed to lead closer to awakening. But the truth was, it was easy to get lost. Easy to let the body move while the mind drifted. Easy to fake mindfulness. Not out of laziness, but because you were still human, even in the robes of the devout. Temples weren't immune to the petty troubles of the outside world, either. Disagreements still happened. Quiet ones, sharp glances, a cold shoulder at the water basin. Senior monks might hold unspoken hierarchies. Favor could be earned or lost. Even in a place dedicated to release from ego, ego found a way to survive. You learned to navigate it, to avoid the wrong eyes, to say the right nothing. Some monks found a kind of peace in this rhythm. Others didn't. Some held tightly to their vows, chanting with focused breath and eyes half closed. Others went through the motions, unsure if the enlightenment they sought was real, or just another kind of illusion. And that doubt, that silent whisper behind the discipline, was something rarely spoken of. But it lived in many hearts. Outside, the seasons turned. Cherry blossoms fell and rotted. Summer heat soaked through robes and left sweat marks on the old temple floors. Autumn winds whispered through paper walls. Winter brought biting cold that no fire fully softened. Time didn't stop inside the temple. It passed, slow and circular. And in that slowness, a monk gave up something deeper than family or name. He gave up the need to be seen, to be remembered, to be anyone at all. That was the hardest part. And it came not at the start, but here, in the long, quiet middle. The air inside the monastery's study chamber was thick with incense, dust, and the quiet weight of centuries-old expectations. Scrolls lined the walls in neatly stacked cubbyholes, their faded labels whispering of generations long gone. Some were yellowed with age and brittle at the edges, while others were fresh, crisp, and smelling faintly of new ink and pine wood. This wasn't a place where voices rose. It wasn't a place where anything moved quickly. Everything here was about patience, repetition, and the deep silence of discipline. Oil lamps flickered softly in the corners, their flames casting slow-moving shadows across the woven tatami floor. The only sounds were the soft swish of robes shifting, the gentle scratch of brushes meeting paper, and the intermittent creak of old wooden beams settling in the ceiling. In the dim light, a monk knelt alone, bent over a wide scroll of sacred sutra text. His knees rested on a thin mat, already worn from years of use, and his posture was fixed, more out of habit than comfort. In one hand, he held a fine-tipped brush, its bristles damp with black ink, ground from an inkstone beside him. His fingers were stained, not just from the day's work, but from weeks, months, of the same unending task. His back ached, his shoulders burned, but he kept going. Calligraphy was more than writing here. It was not a hobby or creative outlet. It was a ritual, a test, a practice of both body and mind. Every stroke mattered. Every character had to be just right. A single smudge or crooked mark meant starting again from the top. There were no shortcuts. Hours could pass unnoticed. Entire days could vanish into the quiet rhythm of the brush. Line after line, word after word, each repeated not to memorize, but to internalize, to embody. This was meditation by motion, and punishment by persistence. To stop was to fail. To speak was to break the spell. There were no desks, only low wooden stands barely above floor level. No chairs, just aching knees and the steady pressure of discipline. The ink had to be ground fresh each day by hand, mixing stick and water until the consistency was just right. The brush was small and demanding. Every breath had to be measured, every movement deliberate. You learned to steady your hand through force of will, to still your thoughts by sheer repetition. The slightest distraction meant ruin. A drifting mind led to mistakes, a sudden itch, a shift in balance, a tremble in the wrist. It could all destroy a full day's work. Some monks spent years chasing mastery of a single script style, never quite satisfied with their own performance. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about submission to the form, about aligning mind, breath, body, and intention. The process was relentless, but it was also sacred. There was no warmth in winter, no breeze in summer. The room remained unchanged, indifferent to the seasons. The only constant was the weight of the task at hand and the legacy of those who had copied the same lines before you. To be chosen to copy sacred text was an honor, yes, but it was also a burden. The test wasn't physical alone. It was spiritual, psychological. Not every monk passed it. Some broke under the pressure. Some drifted into a hollow state, their hands moving while their minds faded. A few, over many long years, found peace in the ritual, in the repetition, in the quiet triumph of one perfect character. In the end, enlightenment didn't come like a sudden flame. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. For monks like these, it arrived slowly, if it came at all, in aching hands, in practiced breath, in silent hours spent kneeling on cold floors, brush in hand, chasing stillness through motion. The monastery bell had already rung 3 times before you stirred. You didn't sleep deeply. You never really did. Not anymore. The stone floor beneath your straw mat left your bones aching, and the chill that settled in during the night clung to your robes like damp wool. Morning prayers had started. You were late. But no one came to rouse you. That wasn't their job. Discipline here wasn't enforced through punishment. It was internal, quiet, unrelenting. The worst failure was failing yourself. So you rose without a word. You folded your bedding, swept the few loose husks of straw from your mat, and slipped on your outer robes. They were coarse from use. Their once vivid color faded by wind and washing. But you wore them with care. In a place like this, how you did something mattered more than what you did. You stepped into the corridor. It was dim and silent, save for the distant chant of voices, soft, slow, in rhythm. The temple grounds were barely lit, the sun still waiting behind a veil of mist. Through the courtyard, past the worn stepping stones, the scent of pine and old incense clung to the air. You bowed your head as you passed the sacred gate, even though no one watched. That was the point. The gods, if they cared at all, saw more than eyes ever could. Inside the hall, the others were already kneeling. Rows of shaved heads bowed low, hands pressed together, bodies still as statues. You moved into place at the end of the line. The chant flowed around you like a river. Ancient words repeated so many times they no longer needed to be understood to carry meaning. Your knees ached, your back stiffened, but you held your posture. This was not a punishment. This was the rhythm of devotion. After the final bell, breakfast followed. Rice and pickled vegetables, maybe a turnip or two. You ate in silence, not because of a rule, but because the silence was part of the meal. Every bite was taken with awareness. Every swallow honored the work that went into the bowl. You bowed to your food. You bowed after eating. The kitchen monks collected the bowls. No one wasted a grain. And then it was time for labor. Not sermons or debate, but physical work. Raking gravel in the temple garden, carrying buckets of water to the bathhouse, scrubbing the moss off the walkway stones. It didn't matter who you were before. A soldier, a nobleman's son, a farmer. Here everyone's hands got dirty. The labor wasn't about productivity. The gardens didn't need to be perfect. The stones didn't need to shine. It was about being present, steady, focused. You didn't rake the gravel to clear it. You raked it to see how steady your mind was that day. And when your thoughts wandered, when your grip tightened, your jaw clenched, or you began to rush, you started over, again and again, until your body and your mind moved as one. This was the discipline you traded the outside world for. No applause, no reward, just the slow sharpening of a soul in silence. The monastery was silent, but not still. In the hushed corridors where echoes dared not linger, monks moved with deliberate calm. But under that slow pace and lowered gaze, a quiet tension simmered. Part of becoming a monk in ancient Japan wasn't just about what you did every day. It was about what you didn't do, what you gave up, and what you carried in silence. By the time a monk reached his 16th year in the order, assuming he'd entered young, he had already left behind more than most people realized. Not just family, possessions, or ambitions, but identity. The robes were not just a uniform. They were erasure. Your name, once spoken with familiarity, faded into something quieter, something more distant. You became part of a collective rhythm, not an individual melody. Meals, once a communal comfort in normal life, became rituals of silence and austerity. Rice, miso, pickled vegetables, served in the same bowls, measured with the same discipline. You didn't eat for pleasure. You ate to sustain the body, so the spirit could do its work. And yet, hunger still visited often, especially in winter, when supplies were thin, and the cold bit through walls and robes alike. The passage of time was marked not by festivals or family celebrations, but by chores, prayers, and the changing of temple duties, cleaning the grounds, hauling water, mending robes, copying sutras by candlelight until your fingers cramped. You'd begin to forget what your voice sounded like in casual conversation. There was no joking, no storytelling, no boasting, only chants, murmured in unison, words passed down over generations like sacred fire. Sometimes a visitor would arrive, a merchant, a traveler, a samurai seeking counsel. Their presence reminded you of the world you'd stepped away from, the way they laughed too loudly or stood with a casual tilt you were no longer allowed. It reminded you that your path was different, that you had chosen, or been chosen, to live by rules that demanded not just discipline, but detachment. And yet, under all of it, you learned to listen differently, to the wind in the bamboo, to the slow creak of temple wood under shifting seasons, to your own heartbeat echoing in stillness. The world hadn't become smaller. It had simply changed shape. The distractions were gone. What remained was clarity, or at least the struggle to find it, even in the silence, even in the sacrifice. Being a monk wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. Every day was a quiet test, and while the world outside raced ahead in noise and motion, here in the monastery, life was measured by breath, by step, by stillness, and by how much of yourself you were willing to leave behind to keep going. The monastery is quiet now, the kind of deep silence that seeps into your bones. But even in stillness, the discipline doesn't ease. By the 17th year of your life as a monk, if you've lasted that long, your days are a tapestry of strict routine, endless repetition, and a kind of peace that's been carved out through relentless self-denial. Gone are the early shocks of monastic life. The hunger, the isolation, the aching feet from long hours kneeling on cold wooden floors. You still feel these things, but differently. Now. They're less interruptions and more like shadows you've learned to live alongside. The pain hasn't vanished, it's just become familiar. Your body has hardened, your stomach adjusted, your mind subdued. You no longer question the rituals, the pre-dawn wake-up call, the frigid wash basin that bites like winter into your skin, the layers of robes tied tight against the morning wind. You move through it all in silence. Not because silence is easy, but because words have become luxuries. Every syllable is measured, every breath accounted for. There's power in restraint. Or at least, that's what you've been taught. The temple halls carry the weight of generations. You feel it in the floorboards, worn smooth by the footsteps of monks long gone. You feel it in the incense, thick in the air, sweet and smoky, curling like a ghost around the rafters. And you feel it in the scrolls, which you copy by hand every week, brush steady, posture straight, hours slipping by unnoticed. These aren't simply words, they're echoes, preserved thoughts, instructions from lifetimes before your own. You've given up more than most people could imagine. Family, romance, identity, the little indulgences that seem so trivial to outsiders, a favorite dish, a soft blanket, a single night of laughter, have all faded into distant memories. You remember them the way you remember dreams. Vague, slippery, not entirely real. The you who enjoyed those things no longer exists. Now, you belong to something else. Not a god, not a teacher, not even the temple. You belong to the structure itself, the rhythm, the stillness, the system that doesn't praise or punish but simply expects. You rise because it's time. You bow because that's the motion. You endure because that's what you do. But inside all that discipline, buried under years of habit, there's a quiet kind of pride. Not boastful, not loud, just a simple, enduring recognition that you chose this, and that every day you choose it again, even when it hurts, even when it's lonely, even when the silence feels like a wall instead of a comfort, because for better or worse, this is your life now. And in that life, there is stillness. there is purpose, and there is peace, but only the kind you earn, breath by breath, day by day, in the quiet heart of a temple that never truly sleeps. The cold of early morning had faded, but the stone halls of the monastery clung to their chill with stubborn persistence. Even as sunlight pushed against the wooden shutters, the air inside remained unmoved, still, thin, and unforgiving. By the time a monk reached his 18th year of service within the temple walls, the routines had become second nature. Every movement, every syllable of prayer, every silent nod of obedience had been repeated so often they felt less like decisions and more like instincts. There was no longer any hesitation upon waking, no moment of forgetfulness before bowing. The discipline had seeped into his bones, into his breath, until it was indistinguishable from who he was. But the passage of 18 years wasn't a triumph. It wasn't celebrated. There was no ritual to mark the moment, no recognition from elders or peers. It passed like the wind, invisible but deeply felt. Youth had faded away, not suddenly but in a slow erosion marked by stiff joints and deep sighs. What once felt like noble sacrifice, early mornings, cold baths, silence, had turned into an unrelenting routine that left no room for softness or personal reflection. The austerity he once embraced had become a quiet weight, pressing against his ribs with every breath. Now, in the 18th year, he wasn't just a disciple. He was an anchor in the monastery's daily rhythm, a pillar expected to hold firm. Younger monks turned to him for silent guidance, watching his every move for clues on how to endure. The elders watched with expectation, not encouragement. Perfection was the bare minimum. He was often tasked with transcribing sacred texts, sometimes entire volumes of sutras, carefully copying line after line by hand. His fingers, stained with ink, moved with mechanical precision. The smell of parchment and old books never left him. If he made a mistake, the scroll was destroyed, and he began again. Not a word of complaint was allowed, not a single sigh. He could identify every bell by sound and purpose, the deep, rolling call to meditation, the shrill note that signaled a visitor, the steady chime that marked mealtimes. These tones shaped his day more than sunlight or sleep. And though he once spoke with energy and curiosity, now his voice was quiet, slow, molded by years of chanting in stone corridors. Words, when spoken, were deliberate, measured, every syllable earned. More often than not, he said nothing at all. His body, once quick to rise and move, had grown used to discomfort. Knees ached from countless hours kneeling in prayer or during meals. His back carried the quiet agony of endless sweeping, hauling buckets of cold water from the well, chopping firewood in silence. These weren't dramatic wounds. No scars marked his skin. But the damage was there, woven into the way he stood, the way he rested his hands on his thighs to rise. These were the tolls of devotion, invisible but constant. Many monks had entered the temple to escape the noise of the outside world, wars, betrayal, shame, or grief. They thought they were trading chaos for peace. But after 18 years, it was clear that peace wasn't passive. It demanded just as much as war, perhaps more. The walls kept the outside at bay, but they replaced it with another force, the crushing pressure of unbroken expectation. There was no violence here, but there was also no freedom. This was the real shape of devotion. Not romantic, not serene, just deep, relentless, binding. It didn't soften with time. It hardened, tightening its grip. The outside world moved on, forgetting the monk entirely. But within these walls, his identity had become inseparable from the silence. And when night fell, and candles burned low, and the final chants dissolved into the darkness, he lay on his bedding. Thin, worn, familiar. He stared up at the beams of the ceiling above, rough and aged like his hands. 18 years, 18 winters, 18 silent summers. There was no applause, no end in sight, just the faint creak of old wood and the knowledge that he would rise again tomorrow to do it all over. And in that stillness, as sleep hesitated at the edge of his thoughts, a quiet question lingered like breath in cold air. Was this peace? Or had he simply built another prison around himself and called it sanctuary? The temple bell echoes softly in the late afternoon light, its low chime spreading through the compound like a ripple across still water. But you don't hear it the way a visitor might. You feel it in your bones, like an hourglass turning over again. For monks in ancient Japan, the day didn't end in leisure. It simply shifted focus. Evenings weren't a time to unwind. They were part of the cycle. After a full day of labor, study, and ritual, your body might be weary, but your mind had to stay alert. Evening brought with it a new round of chanting, sutras recited with voices trained to remain steady even when the stomach grumbled and the limbs ached. The atmosphere inside the main hall was dim. Oil lamps flickered against wooden beams, polished smooth by generations of hands. The floor, cold even in summer, reminded you of where you were. Not in a home, not in a palace, but in service. To the teachings, to the path, to something greater than comfort. Dinner came next, but the word dinner is generous. It was a simple meal, modest in both content and ceremony. Rice, maybe miso, some pickled vegetables, the occasional root, or seasonal green. Meals were silent, save for the sounds of utensils against bowls and the steady rhythm of thought. Gratitude was practiced, not spoken. You didn't eat for taste. You ate for function, to sustain the body so the mind could endure. No second helpings, no lingering. The food was always enough and never too much. Afterward came cleaning, not by servants, not by novices, but by everyone. Even senior monks picked up brooms, washed bowls, swept corners. The act was its own form of meditation, a reminder that pride had no place here. Dust and cobwebs were not just messes to be removed. They were metaphors. To clean was to discipline the ego. As the sun dipped behind the pine trees and the wind settled into quiet, monks returned to their quarters. These were not spacious rooms with beds and privacy. They were sparsely appointed. Tatami mats, a futon if allowed, a place for robes, a space for writing, and that was all. Comfort was stripped to its essence. Possession was a distraction, and sleep was a necessity, not a reward. There were still prayers before rest, quiet ones. You sat cross-legged, facing the wall or the altar, and you breathed. In, outside, not chasing enlightenment, just being present. Thoughts rose. You let them fall away. Pain in your knees or back reminded you of your body. You let that go too. And then came silence. Not the casual quiet of modern life, but a full enveloping stillness. No hum of machines, no street noise, just wind, the occasional rustle of a robe, the crack of old wood adjusting to the night. You lay down, not on a plush mattress, but on a thin mat. You didn't fluff pillows. You didn't scroll through anything. You closed your eyes knowing tomorrow would arrive exactly as today had, with the sound of the bell, the cold floor, and the quiet rhythm of a life you chose, or were chosen for. And in that stillness, you remembered. Being a monk in ancient Japan meant giving up not just the world, but the expectation that your life belonged to you at all. They had taken vows of silence, of obedience, of non-attachment, but none of those promises could fully prepare a monk for the raw quiet that came with isolation, especially in the remote mountain temples of Japan. Part of their discipline, after all, wasn't just about the rituals or the scrolls. It was about withdrawal, physical, emotional, and complete. By the time a monk reached this stage in his spiritual journey, he might be assigned to a solitary hut, far removed from the main hall. Not out of punishment, but as a test, a new phase, a new silence, the kind that didn't just muffle sound, but stripped everything away. No chanting chorus, no shared meals, no soft footsteps echoing through the temple walkways. Just wind, birds, the occasional rustle of a branch, and his own breath. These huts, often no larger than a few tatami mats in size, were perched high on slopes or buried deep in forests. Built from wood, thatch, and earth, they held nothing luxurious: a straw mat, a single robe, a scroll or two, and a simple altar, usually no more than a small stone or weathered statue. This was a place to confront the self, not in grand dramatic revelations, but in slow, grinding reflection. Day after day, in stillness. Meals were sparse, often prepared and left discreetly by novices from the temple below. A small bowl of rice gruel, maybe pickled roots or steamed greens. There was no table, no fire, no conversation. You bowed, you ate, you cleaned your dish with hot water and drank the rinse. Waste not, want not, and speak never. That was the way. Meditation sessions filled the hours, broken only by brief walks around the perimeter of the hut. Even that wasn't done casually. Every step had a rhythm. Every movement was deliberate. You didn't wander. You walked mindfully, measuring your pace with your breath. One inhale, one step, one exhale, another step. Sometimes storms came. Rain would hammer the roof. Wind would lash through the cracks in the walls. You could feel the cold seep in through the soles of your feet. There was no running, no retreat. You sat through it, wrapped in your robe, spine straight, hands resting in your lap. Nature was a teacher too, and her lessons were never comfortable. And then came the dreams, the strange, flickering images that arrived when the body finally gave in to sleep. Memories, fears, even visions. Some monks saw them as distractions. Others believed them to be echoes from deeper levels of awareness. Either way, you didn't chase them, you didn't analyze, you let them rise, you let them fall. Like everything else. It wasn't uncommon for monks to spend weeks, or even months, this way, in total isolation. No voice heard, no face seen, just the long, slow work of emptying the self, shedding ego, letting go of identity, until what remained was something quieter, something steadier. And yet, even at the height of this solitude, the discipline never let up. You didn't sleep in, you didn't slip into laziness. The structure still ruled. The mind, if not kept in check, would wander. And once it wandered too far, the whole purpose of the isolation was lost. So you returned, again and again, to the breath, to the silence, to the stillness. Because to be a monk wasn't to escape the world, it was to face it completely, without distraction, without comfort, and without the armor most people wear just to get through the day. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world outside the temple was still cloaked in darkness and mist, the monks were already awake. Not jolted from sleep, not groaning out of bed, but rising with a sense of rhythm drilled into the bone. They moved in silence, barefoot, their steps soft against the cold wooden floors. Robes were shrugged on and tied with practiced hands, sleeves adjusted, collars straightened. No words were exchanged. Speech wasn't banned at this hour, but it was unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had been said the day before. Everything else could wait. The air bit at their skin. There were no fires burning in these halls, no thick woolen blankets or furs. The architecture was bare, stone, timber, and the occasional tatami mat, and it held onto the chill like a second skin. Their breath showed in puffs as they moved through the stillness. A few monks made their way to the kitchen, where pots were already being stirred with wooden paddles. The morning meal would be simple, like always, a gruel of barley or rice with the faintest whisper of flavor. pickled vegetables if they hadn't run out. There were no complaints. Others grabbed straw brooms and began sweeping the long corridors and outer courtyards, their movements deliberate. It wasn't just a chore. It was a form of meditation. Each brush of bristle against the stone was meant to still the mind, to keep it from wandering. You didn't just clean dust, you cleaned yourself of distraction, one stroke at a time. There was no room for idleness. There was no space for questioning. And above all, there was no reward. Some of the monks were little more than children, faces smooth and wide-eyed, still adjusting to the quiet demands of this world. Others had walked these paths for most of their lives. The years didn't show in their posture or speech, but in the quiet tension they carried, in the subtle hesitation before a ritual began, in the way their eyes occasionally drifted toward the horizon. You learned not to ask what they were thinking. You learned not to wonder if you'd one day become like them. The temple didn't erase you, not completely. It filed you down, rounded your edges, hid the parts that didn't fit. It didn't make you peaceful. It made you silent. And in that silence, you learned to hold your questions like hot coals, never dropping them, never showing the burn. By the time the sun pulled itself over the mountains and smeared pale gold across the clouds, the monks had already lived an entire morning. Chores were done, rituals observed. The world outside had just begun to stretch and yawn, while inside the temple, time had already been shaped into obedience. The peace that outsiders imagined here wasn't the peace of ease, it was the peace of structure, the peace of surrender. You gave up choice so you could stop searching. You gave up voice so you could hear the quiet better. But that quiet had weight. It pressed down on your shoulders. It filled the spaces behind your ribs. It reminded you, in every breath, that the life you lived now didn't belong to you. Not entirely. You were part of something older, colder, and less forgiving. And your job was to disappear into it, as seamlessly as a drop of ink vanishing into water. Outside, the first birds called to each other across the trees. Inside, no one looked up. The day had only just begun, and already every moment was accounted for. Far beyond the temple gates, down muddy paths and past scattered villages nestled among rice paddies, lay the quietest hours of a monk's day, the moments just before dusk, when all labor was done and silence returned to the land. But for some monks, especially those assigned to outposts, way stations, or wandering assignments, this time of day was not marked by the chime of a bell or the warm light of a hearth. It was marked by a different kind of quiet, one edged with loneliness. By the 22nd year of service or solitude, if one was fortunate to live that long in the robes, the toll of the path began to show, not just in the body, but in the spirit. Knees stiffened from decades of kneeling, hands roughened from endless hours of gardening, ink grinding, and carrying firewood. But beyond the wear of the body was something deeper, the weight of memory. A monk might have left family behind, cut off ties with friends, given up ambition and identity. But that didn't mean the memories faded. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, they returned in full color, faces long gone, voices from another life. Many monks wrote about these hours in their private journals. Simple notes, observations, laments that no one else might ever read. A single line about a dream they had, or a bird call that reminded them of a childhood morning, or a question they dared not voice aloud. Had they chosen the right path? Was this silence still sacred, or had it become a kind of prison? These doubts weren't considered sinful, but they weren't encouraged either. Monks were taught to acknowledge them and then let them pass, like clouds over a mountain. Clinging to longing meant clinging to the self, and that was the very thing they were trained to release. So instead, they walked. Some circled the inner paths of the temple courtyard. Others wandered into the forest beyond, sandals brushing fallen leaves, staff tapping roots and stones. These weren't grand pilgrimages or dramatic meditations, just quiet steps, meant to carry the burden of thought out of the mind and into the earth. Step by step, breath by breath. If they passed villagers along the way, They'd bow politely, exchanging brief greetings. Sometimes they were offered food, which they accepted with gratitude. More often, they were ignored. The novelty of a monk in the countryside had long since worn off. These men were seen as fixtures, part of the landscape, familiar but distant. And when night finally fell and the world disappeared into shadow, the monk returned to his quarters, not with answers, not with revelations, just with a little less weight in his chest. This was the quiet work of a monk in his later years. Less about grand teachings, more about staying upright, keeping the heart steady, and learning, slowly, how to be at peace with everything he had left behind. The halls of the monastery have long since fallen silent for the night. The stone floors cold beneath your feet as you make your way quietly through the dim corridors. Shadows flicker along the walls, cast by a single lantern, its flame trembling in rhythm with the faintest stirrings of wind slipping through a crack in the doorframe. By this point in your journey, the rules no longer surprise you. The silence is expected, the darkness familiar, and the stillness a companion. You know which wooden steps creak the loudest, which paper doors slide most easily, and where the scent of old incense still lingers long after the day's final prayer has faded. Tonight, you're not restless from hunger or cold. You're thinking, reflecting. The kind of reflection that creeps in like fog, quiet, persistent, impossible to avoid. Maybe it's the weight of the passing years pressing down on your shoulders, or the aching joints from hours spent kneeling in meditation. Or maybe it's just the relentless stillness itself, drawing your thoughts inward like a tide. There are no distractions here, no wine to dull the mind, no music to lift the spirit, no lovers, no friends, no laughter, just the breath, the floor, the occasional crackle of the lamp, the way the wind nudges the edges of your robe. By now you've given up more than possessions. You've surrendered ambition, identity, even the desire for a legacy. You no longer speak your family name aloud, not because it's forbidden, but because it feels foreign on your tongue. Most days you don't think of your life before this place. The vows were designed to cleanse you of worldly attachments, and in many ways they have. But no vow can banish memory completely. It returns when it pleases, sometimes gently, sometimes like a blade. Once, long ago, you had a different name, a different face. Maybe you were a farmer's son, helping in the fields before sunrise. Maybe you were a merchant's apprentice, counting coins and dreaming of distant ports. Maybe you were a samurai's younger brother, forever in the shadow of armor and duty. Perhaps your robes were silk instead of linen. Perhaps you once knew the feeling of love or the devastation of loss. Perhaps you once laughed so loud it startled birds from trees. That life now feels like it belonged to someone else. And maybe it did. Because the version of you who walks these halls, barefoot and silent, is not the same. Every choice has narrowed the path beneath your feet. Every step forward has been one more surrender, not just of things, but of self. The monks don't talk about it often. There are no confessionals here, no open acknowledgments. But it's there, in the quiet glances after evening prayer, in the near silent moments at communal meals, in the tired, understanding half smiles that say, "Yes, I know. I remember what it was like." And so you keep walking, past the altar where offerings sit untouched, past the empty meditation hall where candlelight once danced, past the shelves of ancient scrolls no one reads anymore, past the quiet courtyard where snow will fall in a few weeks' time and erase all footprints. You step outside for just a moment, into the dark, open stillness. You feel the night air against your face, cool, sharp, and uninviting, and you breathe. Not because it makes you feel free, but because this, too, is part of the vow, to carry the weight of what you gave up, and to do so in silence. to honor the life left behind, not by mourning it, but by enduring its absence. Because peace in this life is not something you stumble upon. It is not a gift. It is not a destination. It is practiced, relentlessly, quietly, without end. In the dim hush of evening, the temple compound in ancient Japan grew quieter still, as if even the wooden beams and tiled roofs exhaled after the slow, structured rhythm of the day. The air, now cooled by the fading touch of the sun, carried a tapestry of scents, aged sandalwood clinging to robes, pine drifting in from the forest edge, and smoke rising in a thin, determined line from a distant brazier. At this hour, when the last light stretched into elongated shadows and the sounds of the outer world fell into distant murmurs, the monks transitioned into the final chapter of their daily practice. But these were not hours of pomp or dramatic ritual. The grandeur of temple processions had passed. What remained was the invisible work, the quiet, sustaining effort that kept monastic life intact. It was a time of final duties, of soft footfalls, of whispered chants, and of small, unspoken acts of discipline. Not everything in a monk's day was about chanting sutras or meditating in stillness. Sometimes the most sacred acts were mundane. By now, the sharp demands of the day had softened into repetition. The bells that had rung through the compound with measured precision had long since marked their final hour, leaving a stillness that felt earned. The temple grounds, once alive with robed figures moving between wooden halls and shrines, now breathed in slow cadence. Shadows stretched along the worn stone paths, long and elegant, while the golden glow of oil lamps flickered gently behind rice paper screens. The light was dim, but it was enough. It always was. Even in the stillness, few monks remained idle. Some moved through the corridors tending to embers in the hearths, coaxing reluctant flames to life with the careful addition of kindling, ensuring warmth would remain through the long night. Others, broom in hand, swept the stone steps of the inner shrine, their motions slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. It was not about removing dust. It was about discipline, about presence. Each movement was a meditation, each gesture a thread in the fabric of their spiritual training. Elsewhere, tucked into the quiet corners of the temple, small lights burned. A senior monk, face lined with years and wisdom, sat cross-legged before a low table, reading in silence. He read not for curiosity or escape, but for memory and focus. Sutras, temple ledgers, the thoughts of long-gone teachers captured on parchment. Down the hall, a younger monk, knees tucked beneath him, hunched over worn fabric, repairing a robe with needle and thread. Each stitch was precise, each tug of the thread a rhythm. The cloth did not need to be perfect. The practice needed to be. For a few monks, the final hours of the day were given over to service, not to gods or rituals, but to the ailing and the elderly within the temple. A bowl of warm, bland rice. A gently wrung cloth placed on a hot forehead. A steadying hand offered to someone whose legs no longer moved with ease. These acts were not noticed by the world beyond the temple gates, but they were central to the life within. Compassion was not advertised. It was lived, quietly and repeatedly, without recognition. Outside the temple walls, the world moved on. Winds stirred the branches of ancient trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. But inside the temple's heart, the sounds of daily life faded, replaced by the deeper stillness of practiced calm. The compound did not sleep. It prepared to. And in doing so, it exhaled. A final bow before the altar. A whispered chant that only the gods or the self might hear. A slow sip of water. The body's quiet acknowledgement of the day's toll. These moments were not endings. They were markers. The day would turn again, and with it the same cycle would begin. There was no applause, no grand conclusion, only the ongoing hum of devotion. The monks did not search for comfort, for reward, or for remembrance. They searched for stillness, for presence, for the slow erosion of ego through ritual and repetition, until only discipline remained. Theirs was not a life of ambition, it was a life of offering. And as the lanterns dimmed and the final footsteps faded down the temple halls, night folded around the compound like dark silk. Sleep came, not as escape, but as another act of faith. And in that silence, peace arrived, not with triumph, but with surrender. The sky above the monastery deepens from the pale silver hues of dawn into the rich, enveloping navy of early night. Another day has slipped quietly through the cloisters and stone courtyards, and with it, another full cycle of devotion, silence, and small, deliberate sacrifices. For those who have chosen this austere life, the bustling world outside has long since faded into the fog of memory, replaced by the slow, disciplined rhythm of monastic duty and reflection. The final rituals of the evening unfold like clockwork, carried out in a hush that has become second nature. A last, humble meal is served without ceremony. It is taken with heads bowed in reverence. A small bowl of rice, a few slices of pickled vegetables, perhaps a ladle of warm miso broth. There is no chatter, no sharing of stories, no eye contact even. The act of eating itself is part of the meditation, another thread in the long fabric of daily discipline. Once finished, each monk silently rinses his bowl, wipes it clean, and returns it with precision to the designated shelf. Then, without a word or signal, they begin to drift from the hall, one by one, toward the dormitory. Their linen robes sweep softly along the polished wooden floorboards. A cool evening breeze slips through paper doors and ripples the edges of hanging scrolls. The warm flicker of oil lanterns throws long shadows across the walls, shadows that sway, stretch, and return to stillness, shaped by the weight of centuries. Little ever seems to change here. Yet, in the quiet, everything shifts. Slowly, subtly, inwardly. Some monks pause at the foot of their sleeping mats, kneeling for a final wordless prayer. Others ease down into the lotus position, eyes closed, bodies still as stone but minds quietly alive, alert and inward facing. A few sit gazing into the darkness beyond the open shutters, where the wind whispers in the pine trees and the crisp scent of resin mixes with the ever-present incense. These men have surrendered family names, ambitions, distractions. They have given up personal identity. They have laid down comfort and let go of the noise of the world. What they hold now is this: breath, bone, silence, sky. For those newly arrived, the ache of detachment still lingers. The echo of laughter from village festivals, the warmth of a fire during a summer celebration, the memory of a mother's lullaby or a sibling's mischief, these things remain. They float at the edge of consciousness like smoke, but in time, they lose their sharpness. They soften. Not erased, but transformed. They are no longer longings, but distant signposts, quiet reminders. To follow this path means to carry the past lightly, to walk forward without looking back too often. Sleep is welcomed early in this world, not for comfort, not for indulgence, but as preparation. There are no bells or calls to wake them, just the habit embedded deep in the body, built from repetition and intent. And when the new day arrives, as it always does, they will rise, not out of obligation, but because it is part of the rhythm. It is what they do. Outside, cicadas hum their ancient hypnotic song. Stars scatter across the black sky, their light effortless and cold. Inside the monastery, the monks settle into their sleep, breaths slowing in unison, deepening into the calm. Peace is not a gift. It is not found. It is something you earn. One breath, one day, one sacrifice at a time. And for those who have given up everything in search of it, this stillness, this fragile quiet at the edge of night, is its own quiet proof. They are no longer chasing. They have arrived.